Okay, welcome back to another episode of Words That Kill. And today our guest is author Christie Stratos, who writes psychological suspense and Dark Victoriana. And that's the topic we'll be discussing today. And I'm going to turn it over to her now and let her introduce herself. So take it away.
Thank you so much, Anita. I'm really excited to be here on your show. So as Anita said, I'm Christie Stratos. I write psychological suspense, and my main series collection right now is the Dark Victoriana Collection. It has 2 books and 2 short stories at the moment, but it is kind of an ever-growing collection. So the first book is Anatomy of a Darkened Heart. The second is Brotherhood of Secrets. You can read them as standalones, but they're better together. And then my 2 short stories are The Wrong House and The Artist. Those are total standalones, but they may play into the books further down the line. So that's my main series. That's what I work on the most. And I'm super excited to get to talk about psychological suspense today.
Oh, well, that's good.
I am.
So we'll start out with the question I ask most of the authors is, how do you craft the killer? Because I know I've read a little bit of your work, so you tend to kind of make normal seem abnormal. So how do you put evil inside normal?
That's a great question. I do like to look at what might be. I mean, most of these groups of people that we have are bizarre in some way or another. So like in Anatomy of a Darkened Heart, for example, we're looking at an abusive family with very, very skewed dynamics. Definitely not what you would ever want to be a part of. So, you know, in that book, we're looking at terms of killing and things like that. I can't say too much because it does give some stuff away, but it is important. Like you said, this would just be an average family in the Victorian era with a lot of problems. So the way that the characters develop and the problems that sort of complicate their lives and their relationships are what lead to some important stuff that I can't talk too much about. But in Brotherhood of Secrets, which I can talk a little bit more about without spoiling anything for you, you know, the idea is that Mr. Locke is looking for, he has a locksmith shop, he's looking for a specific type of employee. And he picks out those employees very carefully. They're all, in some way, they're alone in the world. They have no family, and you know they a lot of times don't have much experience. They're kind of desperate to be accepted. So we've got some character traits right there that are going to lead them to having a dynamic that will be. It'll end up sort of in some ways dependent and in some ways competitive. So, you know, we have like a lot of things coming together to create a strange sort of not blood family. And the dynamic there is, it changes a lot throughout the book as they feel each other out because they're not familiar with each other right off the bat. So, you know, where we see killing in that, I am developing a lot of the characters you see are developed from the point that you join the story, which is when they've all been hired and you see the reasons why they've been hired. And then we start to find out through sort of an unraveling of each of their lives, which ones tend toward more manipulative, which ones tend toward more desperate for acceptance and they'll do whatever, and others tend toward the more violent side. And we see how manipulation plays into Mr. Locke getting one of his members, actually fan favorite character Jude, to commit some murders. That's not a spoiler because it's very obvious who's doing the murders. In that way, we watch one person manipulate another to commit those murders and why. So it's so important, in my opinion. Of course, in psychological suspense, you have to get the psychology right. That's like the whole base of the whole thing.
And I'm currently reading Anatomy, so don't spoil it. But one of the things I found interesting is that Elizabeth, she's obviously one of the antagonist villains, whatever you want to call it, but yeah, you feel some sort of sympathy. So how did you go about getting the reader to feel sympathy for the character like that?
I like for readers to be able to feel sympathy for all of my characters in one way or another. And some of them, of course, are less sympathetic than others, but gray moral areas are one of my favorite things to explore. I absolutely love it. Nothing is black and white, as we all know in real life, but it can be so hard to see that in some situations. And so I really love, you know, talking about those areas that are gray. And for her, we get to watch her develop from, she's already married to her husband, Richard. The reader enters the story where she is giving birth to her daughter. And so we see sort of from that point forward, how her psychology how she gets sort of turned against her daughter right off the bat. And it's the dynamic between her and her husband that does it. And we start to see a little bit more of their history, just weaved in there where appropriate. And, we find out that she's mistreated a bit. He's not the worst husband, but far from the best. And we know that there's a lot wrong in their relationship, and he could treat her a lot better. And then we find out a little bit about her own background before him. And we can clearly see that her own mother was extremely harsh toward her and, put her down a lot and things like that. So we can see that she was never good enough according to her mother. And we see how that kind of comes together with Richard's mistreatment of her, not really treating her the way she should be, as, they're not as close as they should be. There's a reason behind that on his part. And of course, in Victorian society, when people got married, a lot of times it was for comfort or status or anything like that. It wasn't necessarily love. A lot of the time they just wanted to make sure that they'd be taken care of, especially on the woman's side. That was her goal. If I'm going to marry someone, they better be able to support me, because they weren't supposed to work. So, she's marrying someone who can certainly take care of her. Is there love there? We start to find out that he's a lot colder than she is. And she expected something out of this relationship that she's never going to get. So her constant need for that is something that I think a lot of people can relate to when we look at relationships we've made mistakes in, maybe relationships we never should have been in, even just the way people treat each other on an everyday basis. When we see somebody, who is not, you see them act maybe warm towards one person and cold towards another. All those kinds of things come together to make her more sympathetic than just a straight up villain.
Yeah, and she's a very good character, very well rounded.
Thank you.
Anyway, so crafting the atmosphere and tension to create a character death. So how do you go about that? I mean, what sort of elements do you focus on to hype up the suspense of the death of a character?
One of the things that has become sort of a hallmark of my writing, and I actually have trouble not writing this way, is the sense of claustrophobia. So I like to have a closed environment, and you'll notice that it's actually all 4 of the Dark Victoriana Collection books. No matter which one you look at, it is a closed environment. We see a little bit outside of that. The reader gets to experience a little bit outside of the house in Anatomy of a Darkened Heart, the locksmith shop in Brotherhood of Secrets, in The Wrong House. Almost all of it takes place in one particular house, except for the introduction and the final scene. And it's similar in The Artists. The main character, Miss Grant, arrives at a particular house, and everything takes place in that house or on the cliff outside of it. So, part of what I love in using to create that tension that you're talking about is that sense of claustrophobia. We're in one place and that person is stuck there for one reason or another, or those multiple people are stuck there. And a lot of the time, it is a psychological thing. For example, Abigail can't really do too much. She's the main character of Anatomy of a Darkened Heart. And there's not much she can do. As a woman in Victorian society, of course, there's a lot of expectations, and you're only allowed to do so much. So you're held pretty tightly, and even more tightly because her mother is abusive and uses her as a kind of just way to take out all of her aggression and anger about the relationship she has with her husband. A lot of the tension there is rooted in nobody really being able to escape their circumstances. And that's what I focus on very heavily in every one of my Dark Victoriana books. And it's actually making book 3 a little bit difficult to write because I have more of an open world there. And I'm so used to this claustrophobic feel, and I feel so comfortable with it, actually, that writing in a more open world has proven difficult for me. But yeah, a lot of the foreboding is in how these people are tethered together, and they can't escape each other. Even if they want to, they'd have to do something so extraordinarily drastic that it would be going against the societal expectations of the times, which is very difficult in such a stiff sort of society. So that's one of the biggest ways I create tension in my books.
Well, that claustrophobia and psychological stuckness, for lack of a better word, it's you can see it in abusive relationships even today. So I mean, I think it's not just for period as well. I think people can relate to it today as well. So speaking of psychological, so how do you tailor your character reactions and your motivations of it when it comes to killing characters?
Well, we always see the reader is always able to see sort of the crescendo that leads to it. So in Brotherhood of Secrets, I think this is kind of a prime example. Jude is the most violent character. He has a lot of trouble controlling himself. He also, similar to Abigail, and they have that in common, which also comes into play in Brotherhood of Secrets. He had also a very abusive childhood. We find out that his parents, his mother had an affair. His father is extraordinarily angry about it, and she's just kind of an enabler. So, he's also endured very heavy abuse, even worse than what Abigail has endured herself. So once we find that out, we see that Mr. Locke is using that tendency to his own advantage. And we find out why later. That's a spoiler I can't share with you. But he sort of gives Jude an excuse to take out all his rage, all his frustration and anger that he has from childhood that he's never been able to work out. Keep in mind that back in the Victorian era, you couldn't exactly just go to a therapist or something, which is much more accepted today than it ever would have been then. You'd be, kind of considered a little bit nuts if you're going to a psychotherapist. They probably would have called it then. So, that wasn't really an option. Talking about your feelings as a man was not really a thing you wanted to do. Even men who, for example, in the Civil War, they ended up on opium a lot of the time because that was what was used to treat their wounds, and they couldn't talk about it because it was considered a weakness. So there's not a lot of openness in that time period, and when you keep all that stuff pent up and you don't know how to fix it and you have no help, it just festers. It's just going to fester and get worse and worse and worse. So Mr. Locke takes advantage of that. He uses that to his benefit. The idea, one of the things that I want to get across is that if it hadn't been Mr. Locke, maybe Jude would have run into somebody like a much better person who could have helped him, and that's part of the idea. It does depend on who we interact with and what we know. So if we're surrounded all our lives by terribly abusive people, it's going to be really hard to get out of an angry place, in our lives. But if we end up and somehow realize and are able to surround ourselves with better people who can help us and sort of soothe some of those wounds and help us see what we're going through isn't our fault, things like that, where it came from, you can change. You can certainly change. People do it all the time when they have the proper support. So, Jude happens to have exactly the wrong person in his life, and Mr. Locke makes it all so much worse. But of course, to Jude, it feels like a reprieve. Every time I get to hurt somebody, I feel better. That's how he feels. Of course, you can never satisfy that because you're not healing. So, that's, I would say, how I built that sort of crescendo in Brotherhood of Secrets.
So do you have a favorite way of killing characters or weapons of choice that you favor?
I like that question because I really like to come up with unusual ways to kill someone. They're not always like you've never heard of them or something, but I don't like for it to be just, she took a kitchen knife and she, was planning on slitting the woman's throat and she did, something like that. I like to come up with unusual ways to hurt someone. And actually one of the ways, it's a deleted scene, which if you were to join my Patreon for just $1, you could read this particular deleted scene that I'm going to just mention quickly. There's a scene from Brotherhood of Secrets that I deleted where Mr. Locke is very angry at this apprentice for listening in on his conversation. So instead of just slamming him against the wall and, that's it, just slamming him over and over or something like that, he's sort of, it looks like he's going to go grab his collar, but instead he's sort of reaching into this area, that's like above your collarbone and sort of grabbing it like that, which is not something you really do typically. And I don't see that in a whole lot of stuff, but it's funny how we come across these things. I think I was thinking about how that would work, and I was sort of acting it out and thinking, well, like, Mr. Locke is a pretty cruel man, and he's very manipulative. So instead of just doing an outward threat of just slamming this kid against the wall, what would he do? Well, he'd want to hurt him in some weird way that would be sort of disturbing and unexpected and catch him off his guard. So when he starts reaching in and sort of pushing his fingers like down and behind his collarbone. I mean, what are you going to do about that? You're so surprised and shocked. So like, I like coming up with unusual stuff like that where I can, and definitely making it a struggle or a shock when the murder that you actually get to see happens. So, you know, that's kind of a long-winded explanation, but I like to try and come up with some new stuff.
Yeah, that's kind of an intimate invasion of attack as well. So yeah, that would freak people out, I would think.
Exactly.
So that brings me to the next question is, what kind of research do you do? Because I know you do a lot of research.
I do a ton of research. It's a bread and butter question. So yeah, I do research on, of course, the Victorian era, everything from, you know, what would a middle class, you know, person's house, what would the floor be made of? What would you clean it with? You know, and all the way to, of course, like what kind of weapons would be around at the time. But I don't use many typical weapons, so that's not so much of a problem. You know, what would somebody who comes from a poorer household see when they walk into a very wealthy household, and how would they, you know, sort of perceive it? You know, what kind of experience would that be? I do a lot of research on food. I have some cookbooks from the time that I look at, and I do a lot of research to find out sort of, you know, what would be a wealthier thing that somebody would eat, what would be a lower end thing, so you can kind of get the feel for the classes as well, because that was a big thing back then too. And then in terms of psychology, a lot of the psychology research I do surprises people. I actually read a lot of autobiographies and biographies of old celebrities. So like, obviously this is backed up by actual psychological research, but kind of once you've got a handle on that, one of the most interesting things I like to do is read these biographies, autobiographies, compare them, and sort of, for myself, figure out what the truth probably is. Because all of them bend things to some degree. And you know what they say, there's your truth and my truth, and then there's the actual truth in between, what really happened. So I love doing that because you can see very clear differences between what somebody says about somebody else and what they say about themselves. And you can start to figure out the real, like, what is realistic, what actually makes sense, where is that balance in between. And one of my favorite examples is super famous actress Joan Crawford, back from that time period, where a lot of the things that she says, the way that she says she never was, she insists that she, you know, doesn't have to have everything just so, and she's, you know, not manipulative in this way or another. If you were to read one of her several, it's not quite an autobiography, but it's sort of, one of them is called My Way of Life. It's that kind of a thing where she's letting you have a peek into her life. You can see exactly what she's like. Yeah. And it's not what she says, you know, it's nowhere near it. And the things that she thinks are normal, that are kind of strange. A lot of the things where, you know, one of my favorite examples is typically when you're married or in a serious relationship, let's say, let's hope that you're very close with that person, and they see you and you see them in kind of every state, every emotional state, every physical state, and you're very close, right? And that's part of what makes you close. And in Joan Crawford's book, this particular book that I'm thinking of, she says, never exercise when your husband is home. He doesn't want to see you on the floor, which is what, you know, a lot of women back then would do. They just, you know, not go to a gym, but do things at home. And she says, he doesn't want to see you rolling around on the floor and it makes you look like a child. And he, you know, he doesn't want to see you looking like that. That's not a statement of the times. That's just Joan Crawford. Like, that's not a thing. That's just her. So, like, you know, I use a lot of that stuff to sort of figure out the psychology behind someone like that and why she would try to give those kinds of impressions. And then I apply that kind of stuff to my fiction.
Yeah. Okay. So, what was the weirdest thing you've ever had to research in relation to a death scene for a character?
Oh, weird things in relation to a death scene. I had to research whether you could stab someone through the forehead easily, because there's obviously that bone there, and I wasn't sure if it was easy to penetrate or if someone would have to go in the side instead, like whether it would have to be the temple. And originally I had this one scene, I'm going to say what book it's from, so it's not a spoiler, but I had a scene where somebody was going to stab somebody else in the forehead, and then I realized, would they go through or would they just kind of glance off of the skull? You know, after a while I realized that might not work. They might have to get in that softer part that doesn't have that hard, you know, skull in the way. So
Okay, for the record, the easiest way would be to go into the eye.
yes, it would be. It would be. But it was a little, I was aiming for a specific type of thing.
Yeah.
But yes, you're absolutely right. It is the eye, and I do.
Yeah, but I do know some people might get squeamish on that.
It's like too much, right? But you're right. Yeah, it is the eye.
Okay, yeah, you can tell I've done a lot of research on this. Just say I've done research. This is not from experience.
That came to you too easily, Anita.
Yeah, well, stabbing is one of my favorite ways to kill characters in my own books. So I have done a lot of research on how to stab people and where the best spots are.
That's one of those things. I wish I had a more unique type of thing, but I just remember it so well and being like, oh God, I don't want to see pictures of anything. No, that's going to give me a nightmare.
But I mean, you do have to research things like that, because I mean, I had to research a few things. Would it work? Like cutting a tongue out. Would someone survive in 15th century Venice if they had their tongue cut out? Yeah. The answer is no.
Gross. Yeah, that's terrible.
Yeah, so that had to be rewritten.
That's a good one. That's a good one.
So yeah, you do have to research things like that to make sure they're accurate, or someone's going to call you out.
Yeah, you can't have a weak stomach for that stuff, right?
Yeah, it's funny though. If I see it in real life, I'm just like, ugh.
Yeah.
But research it's different, because it's kind of, I guess it's because it's so clinical.
That's right. Exactly. That's what I think too. And like, I used to watch a lot more bloody movies than I do now. And sometimes now something like some of the Saw movies, some of the later Saw movies are too much for me, where they start turning people's legs backwards. Like that grosses me out. Things like that with little like limbs or individual limbs or like small parts of your body, that freaks me out a lot. But if I had to research it, like you say, it's clinical. You're looking at it from such a totally different perspective. It just doesn't bother you the same way. Although the eye stuff is still gross. Yeah.
Okay, on that note, I think we'll wrap it up here, and I'll let you tell everybody where they can find you and your books.
Thank you so much. This is so much fun. I really enjoy talking about this stuff. I don't always get the chance to really talk in this bloody detail. So you can find me at ChristieStratos.com. That's my website. You can buy signed paperbacks that are also specially gift wrapped with, it matches, the gift wrapping matches the actual books and the themes of the books. You can also find me on patreon.com/ChristieStratos, where you can join at $1 a month. It's that little to get most of the rewards. And then, of course, I'm on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. I'm also on Binge Books, which is a newer site, Goodreads, and you can buy my books, except for The Wrong House, everywhere ebooks are sold. And I really appreciate that you had me on. I really enjoyed it.
Okay, and thank you for being here. It was a pleasure chatting with you.
You too.
And that's it for this episode of Words That Kill. And we'll be back sometime later with a new guest and a new topic, so join us then. So bye for now.
Abigail was instinctively afraid of Mother, the woman always wearing a stern and somewhat angry expression. She was usually either clunking somewhere in a hurry, as if it was someone's doomsday, or she was sitting straight-backed in the parlor's stiff armchair, constantly looking at the door as if she were waiting. Whatever she was waiting for never seemed to come. Dinner was an intimidating sport, with both her parents looming over her, stiff and formal. Neither had anything to say to her. They barely had anything to say to each other. Dinner would be served to them, put on their plates for them, eaten roughly by her mother and oddly quietly by her father, and the most that was said to her was, "You may go," by her mother almost as soon as she'd finished her meal. Abigail found that out when she stayed too long one time, squirming in her seat slightly and trying to say she wanted more food, but before she could get the second word out, her mother reprimanded her. "Do not squirm in your seat, or you won't be accepted into better company." Her mother had paused, looking down at her own half-empty plate. Without sparing a glance at Abigail, she'd muttered, "Leave us." When Abigail hesitated, a little frightened to make the wrong move, her mother's cold gaze told her to get out of the chair, now. These situations didn't bother her too much, aside from the immediate tension and fear. Abigail didn't really think of this woman as her mother. She thought of her as a woman in the house. She tried to forget about her presence altogether in between awkward and intimidating meetings. Most of Abigail's time was spent in her room or outside with the governess. The governess had to teach her how to play, with toys and without them. Abigail preferred to sit and look around and think. The governess didn't like this. But Abigail didn't feel like a little girl. She would play hopscotch with a straight face, sitting down in the middle of the board when she was done with it. And little dolls didn't interest her. She wanted to try things with them, like taking out strands of their hair and braiding them separate from the dolls, or taking off their clothes and just playing with the clothes. The governess told her she was supposed to play with those things on the dolls, not off. But Abigail had no interest in the dolls themselves, only in what she could keep from them.
The clock ticked loudly in the parlor as Miss Grant and Mr. Markham sat oddly silent, having just met. The servants had accepted her into the house with very little fuss, as if she had been there many times before and was just visiting again. Miss Grant glanced furtively at Mr. Markham. He was young, as the ad said, but as a war veteran, the only injury she could see was a long, deeply indented scar that drew from his left ear straight across his cheek and angled to the bottom of his chin. When she had responded to the veteran's ads in the past, there had always been something more than scars. A missing limb, sometimes two, heart conditions, permanent shock. But a scar? Was that really all? If so, why had he felt the need to take out an ad for a companion? Surely he had plenty of friends, especially with such good looks. Perfectly straight nose, strong chin, well-balanced lips, and thick brown hair. The wealth she saw in his house was also in his handsome features. His scar didn't mar anything but his skin. But perhaps the problem was underneath it all, inside his soul. If that was the case, she could still try to help. Pursing her lips, Miss Grant wondered why the silence felt commanding, thick. Discomfort overwhelmed the idea of speaking. After a while, Mr. Markham inhaled audibly and said,
"Would you like some refreshment before you settle in upstairs?"
His voice was scratchy with exhaustion, as if it had been he who had traveled all this way just to be let down. Miss Grant nodded in one clear motion. Yes, that would be nice. Mr. Markham rang a small bell on a little table next to him. The kindly but quiet maid, Mrs. Jones, who had received Miss Grant at the front door.
"You may call me Jones, miss."
With an outdated curtsy, discreetly entered the room and closed the door behind her. She couldn't have been older than 40, with a pleasant look despite the lack of a smile on her face. She seemed to approach his chair with caution, bent slightly forward with her hands clasped in her lap, and she stopped where she could just barely see him. She leaned forward to look at him from the right, the side without the scar.
"Tea."
He said with unnecessary harsh authority.
"Yes, sir."
Jones didn't look at Miss Grant. She simply left carefully and quietly. What a strange place, Miss Grant thought. Silence settled in again with a consistency she could only describe as pudding thick.
"Why, miss..."
Mr. Markham asked, the quiet so suddenly pierced that it startled Miss Grant. Excuse me?
You've been married before, but you aren't anymore. I made inquiries about you after you wrote me."
Before or after you accepted me to come here?
"Both."
Miss Grant's eyebrows rose sharply. Perhaps this was a big mistake.